With no agreement on ending deforestation, what will be the future for the Amazon? Brazil's 8-nation Amazon summit succeeded in assembling leaders from the region, but failed to agree on key issues, including oil exploration and deforestation. So, if they can't agree on how to protect their own backyard, how much longer can the lungs of the world hold out? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is the Amazon. Well, scientists estimate that at the current rate of deforestation, huge tracts of the Amazon could become savanna within 10 years. 20% of the entire rainforest has already been destroyed, but Brazil is trying to walk some of that back. This year alone, they have managed to decrease deforestation by about 42%, but not all countries are prepared to go that far, as long as oil exploration and drilling are seen as a means to boost their struggling economies. So, what's the solution, and why should we fight to protect the rainforest?
The Amazon is the world's largest rainforest, covering over 6 million square kilometers of South America. A large part of it is in Brazil, and 8 other countries share the rest. The rainforest is home to 1 in 10 known species of fauna on Earth. It is one of the planet's last habitats for animals like jaguars, harpy eagles, and black spider monkeys. It also contains thousands of freshwater fish species. The Amazon also hosts about 80,000 plant species. More than half of them are critical for global water and carbon cycles. That makes it a natural climate protector. The Amazon stabilizes regional temperatures and helps to regulate the Earth's climate by absorbing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and releasing oxygen back into the atmosphere. It's known as a carbon sink, meaning it absorbs more carbon dioxide than it releases. And it's also a global medicine chest. Several vital medications have been derived from ingredients growing in the rainforest, including anesthetics, cancer treatments, and malaria medication. So why is this natural wonder under threat? Ranchers are clearing large swaths of the forest for cattle pasture. Meanwhile, farmers are cutting the trees to yield crops. Settlements are also expanding into the rainforest, causing damage to the ecosystem. And there are construction plans for new railways, roads, and dams through the Amazon. If it goes ahead, it will exacerbate the destruction. Increased demand for timber products is driving legal and illegal logging, which causes huge deforestation. Mining activities are polluting water and threatening indigenous communities and their livelihoods.
If there is no consent, we are not going to authorize public policies in every government to carry out extractivist mining or oil projects in the forest, in nature. We, indigenous peoples, say no to that. We, the indigenous peoples, say yes to life, because the Amazon is where everything is.
The biggest threat, however, is climate change. Rising temperatures in the Amazon region are fueling devastating wildfires. Earlier this month, leaders of the 8 Amazon nations gathered in Brazil to find solutions to these pressing threats. The summit was led by Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, who was elected on a promise to end deforestation in the Amazon by 2030.
We will leave a legacy of well-being, prosperity, and social justice for our descendants. The Amazon will be what we want it to be, an Amazon with greener cities, cleaner air, mercury-free rivers, and standing forests.
The leaders signed an 113-point agenda called the Bellum Declaration. They agreed to promote national goals to stop deforestation and protect biodiversity. Yet the summit failed to offer concrete policies on how to achieve the goals. There were also diverging positions between the countries on oil. Colombian President Gustavo Petro has been campaigning for an end to exploration in the region, while Brazil is discussing developing a huge oil field near the mouth of the Amazon River.
Neither summit nor declaration were able to respond adequately to the climate change context we live in right now. We are in a climate emergency, and the multilateral process, from what we have seen here in Belém, is just not enough to deal with that.
Lula said international support is key to saving the rainforest and has called for the Amazon nations to be united ahead of the COP28 summit in Abu Dhabi. He says rich countries that have already destroyed their forests should take responsibility for funding the prosperity of the Amazon.
If we continue to deforest, we will continue to have problems not only for indigenous people but also for all people. We must preserve it so that our grandchildren and children can live well, sleep well, eat well, and be happy like us.
So, can the lungs of the world be saved? And if so, is it only a matter of political will and coordination? Well, joining me now to debate that and more are from Martinique, Christian Poirier. He's the program director at Amazon Watch. From Yungay, Peru, University of Leeds, Associate Professor of Latin American Studies, Rebecca Jarman. And from Brasilia is the president of the Economic Freedom Foundation, Marcio Coimbra. Thanks all so much for being with me. Well, let's start quickly by getting everyone's take on where things stand now. Christian, you know, it's normal for Brazil especially to want to put the most positive spin on the ACTO meeting that they called for, but given the goal of ending deforestation by 2030 was not reached, do you think enough was salvaged in this meeting to say that real progress was actually made?
Well, first off, I think it's really important to take note that this was the first Amazon Cooperation Treaty Organization meeting since 2009. And in the midst of the climate catastrophe that we are living today, it's very important that Lula was able to convene these heads of state to address this crisis and to look for solutions. So while these were ambitious efforts, the final text of the summit essentially contains a series of good intentions without benchmarks, without timelines. Therefore, the document really fails in advancing critical protections for the rainforest and for human rights.
Okay, let me ask Marcio, because you are in Brazil, you are Brazilian, this is your president. Are you impressed with at least the fact that he made this effort? Or do too many Brazilian people feel protecting the Amazon rainforest comes at just too high of an economic cost for them?
It looks like for Brazil that Brazil is making an international move in order to regain weight in the international scenario after the last government. So since Lula has this preeminence as being a leader among other nations, he's using the Amazon as his card, presenting Brazil again to the world. So I believe that his effort is real, but it's connected with his political ambition in the country. It means that the two themes are connected. The political effort that Lula is making in Brazil inside, and also the connections that he's making outside, presenting a new country after the last right-wing government in Brazil.
Let me ask you this, though, Marcio. The meeting in itself seemed to actually really highlight a pretty important divide between Colombia and Brazil, and that Colombia says oil drilling, for example, should stop, period, while Brazil, Lula has said no because it has oil projects in the works through its national champion, Petrobras. Does it seem a contradiction, or are Brazilians and leaders there okay with it?
It seems a contradiction, but if you look inside our country, since we have political stability that is very narrow since the last elections, Lula for him is very important to gain political support from Congress. And if he goes against this right now, he's gonna fight against important leaders in Congress that are in favor of that. I personally think that he thinks he should not be doing that. But as a matter of political calculation, he is letting the issue go a little bit in order to gain support in Congress to pass another bills and another project that he also thinks that are important and has a direct impact in the life of Brazilians, like, for example, the economic crisis that Brazil was going through.
Okay. Let me turn to Rebecca now, and I'll just ask you if you feel good about where things are going right now in respect to, conservation in the Amazon.
In this, I largely share Christian's opinion. I welcome the fact that this Congress has taken place. It's an important summit. It's also preparing for future summits such as COP and the UN, which we hope will focus on similar issues of protecting the Amazon. And yet, like Christian, I would argue that this doesn't go far enough. We know that the world's climate is at tipping point. Temperatures are rising rapidly, and we do need to take urgent action. And that urgent action should look like, for example, the banning of future oil exploration and drilling, and halt of deforestation.
So let me ask you what you made, for example, of Colombia's president and the speech he gave, calling out everybody in this conference for just really making speeches.
It's an interesting question, and I think largely that reveals political differences between Petro, the president of Colombia, and some of the other main delegates, including, of course, Lula, who largely represents an older form of left-wing socialism or left-wing politics in Latin America. He forms part of what's called the pink tide, or the rise of socialist politics in the early 2000s. Petro is a newer president. He's newer to the scene. He's got a dynamic young set of followers, political followers in Colombia, who have really pressurized the president to take urgent action. And therefore, his discourse, his perhaps more extreme demands, correspond more to, let's say, the demands of the current moment than the demands of someone like Lula, who has over the past 20 years been considering issues of environmentalism in Brazil, but perhaps hasn't caught up to the urgency that is currently characterizes the issue, and that especially young people feel should be given to the question of saving the rainforest.
Okay. I'm going to come back to Marcio quickly because we're actually going to have to let you go in a few minutes. Let me ask you this, though. One of the so-called takeaways that was publicized in this meeting was that it was a win for indigenous peoples in some respects. Is that the sense you got?
Yes, it is, because in this new government, we have a new ministry that is dealing only with these issues. So it's a big shift for Brazil from the last government to this government in issues concerning environment and indigenous people, for example, because Brazil now has been drawing policies for indigenous people, is taking more care of the environment. We chose Marina Silva, who is a world leader and concerning the Amazon and the environment as the Ministry of Environment. So I believe there is a big shift in the government that the achievements are gonna still to come. We're gonna see probably within a year or two many changes with the indigenous people and the environment in Brazil. It's a very, very slow movement in the country, because still in Brazil, there is a battle between agriculture and indigenous people, agriculture and environment, and we need to push them together. We need to put all these things together in order to move forward with a good agenda for the country.
Okay. Let us get some actually further perspective now from Bolivia. We'll unfortunately have to say goodbye to Marcio in Brasilia. Thank you so much for being with us, Marcio. But let's welcome now journalist Raul Penaranda from the Bolivian capital, La Paz. Raul, thanks for joining us. So Raul, let me ask you, at this latest Amazon Cooperation Treaty Organization summit, Brazil in particular considered Bolivia a holdout. Why so? And help us understand what interests Bolivia is acting in right now.
Okay, yes, sure, Andrea. This is true. Bolivia was the country that prevented a deal in the Amazonian summit because we have in Bolivia some economic problems, and the government thinks that clearing the land, deforesting, and having more agriculture activity, and also having beef farms would be helping the economy. So now the government that is kind of leftist government, but is oriented to agribusiness and also helping peasants from the highlands to go to the lowlands and deforest. So this is the reason. I think that the Bolivian government thinks that this is going to be something important for the Bolivian economy. I think that they are wrong, but that's the idea that they have.
Christian, do you agree that that is the case here? And also then, when you add the kind of illicit industries like loggers and miners in the Amazon to the equation, what do these kinds of pacts actually amount to? If you don't have the political will in a country like Bolivia, plus you have illicit mining and logging throughout the Amazon.
Well, it's really a missed opportunity, I think, by the Organization of Amazonian States to meet this challenge. And really, the call was coming from the Lula government to eliminate deforestation by 2030. And as we've heard here, Bolivia was a holdout. Bolivia essentially sabotaged these efforts for the reasons we've heard. And it's an economic argument, a very flawed one, in my opinion. And it's also important to note, as you say, the illicit economies are exploding in the Amazon today. Illegal mining, illegal logging, land grabbing, narco traffic, they're all linked as well. The declaration speaks to this. It speaks to having better cooperation among states to police, for example, the skies, flights over the Amazon. Many of these operations, for example, mining, and narco traffic are using illicit airstrips that are cut into the forest. And that's a positive, that they're trying to have better law enforcement cooperation across the states. However, the problem is so deeply ingrained. If you look at the Brazilian Amazon, for example, it's estimated that about 95% of the timber that's pulled out of Brazil today, of the Brazilian Amazon, is of illegal origin. And it's reaching ports internationally, China, Europe, the United States, that are buying up this conflict commodity, as if it was legitimate. This is a major problem, and it really complicates efforts to rein in deforestation, to rein in the destruction of waterways. That's what illegal mining does.
But Raul, I mean, how badly does Bolivia as a state in this partnership hold back the entire cause of Amazon preservation? Because obviously, I mean, per square mile, Bolivia holds a lot less Amazon than, Brazil or even Colombia.
Yeah, but Andrea, this is the thing. Bolivia is the third country with most deforestation in the world. After Brazil, that is 8 times the size of Bolivia, and after the Democratic Republic of Congo. And we are the third country with most deforestation in the world. This is a tragedy. Last year we lost in Bolivia 4,000 square kilometers, something like the half of Puerto Rico's extension every year. This is something that we have to address in Bolivia. But the government is in this crazy idea that we have to clear the land. And the terrible thing is that we clear the land by burning the forest. This is really terrible. To do what? To have biodiesel, to have corn and wheat, to try to have biodiesels, because we import now our fuels in Bolivia, and the government is trying to change that imports to biodiesels. So if you think that Bolivia is a country that has only 12 million people, but per capita we are deforesting, we are in the first place of deforesting the Amazon, and so this is a big responsibility for Bolivia.
Right. Rebecca, let me come back to you, because we're seeing a lot of kind of short-term, or what many, especially environmentalists, would consider very short-term outlooks when making decisions about the Amazon, for example. So what will happen then if another right-wing politician, wins in Brazil or wins in Colombia? Even Gustavo Petro himself said, and I'm quoting him, that our mandates are very short. So could any progress just be reversed in such an instance? And I mean, would a pact drafted now Is there any way it could have some real permanency should regimes change?
Yeah, I mean, as you mentioned at the head of the program, deforestation in Brazil has recently been cut by over 40% since Lula took up his administration, but there's no reason why that shouldn't be reversed if the political situation changes. Another thing to mention, which I think is really important, is that we're dealing with leaderships from metropolitan areas, from urban areas that are often really far from the places that are under discussion here. And so it's all very well to pass legislation and to hold meetings in some of these major capitals, but when the Amazon regions, the particularly vulnerable regions, are hours and hours away on road transportation, are very difficult to reach. Any kind of legislation that's passed is also very difficult to implement. So Christian was saying about the police agreement over states, of course, that is to be welcomed. But on a day-to-day basis, when there is an absence of state presence, as there is in many of these regions, then it becomes almost after the fact that the vacuum that's left by the state is filled by these narco-trafficking groups, it is filled by illegal loggers, it is filled by illegal miners. And so therefore your question about the permanency of these agreements, that's one issue that of course we have to consider, and the political situation in the region is currently quite volatile, so it's very possible that there will be another shift to the right. But notwithstanding that, even if this leftist trend continues, it's about the implementation and the regulation of some of these policies, which is really hard to do when areas are so far-flung.
And we still have, Christian, I'll finish with you. You know, we still have so many, when it comes to climate change and addressing the issues across the board, we have, you know, to look at the developed countries. And I mean, in this case of the Amazon, look at developed countries, for example, and how much forest land that they have eliminated, you know, to accommodate their growth over the decades and over the centuries. The UK, for example, should actually be really covered in forest had it not been for humans. Instead, there's only maybe about 13% forest land left. So you still have this argument that it's not fair for developing and poor countries in Latin America to have to pick up the cost and curb some of their economic growth in order to adapt to this new climate change that they feel has been caused by developed countries in the first place. But I want to finish on this because you've noted that the Amazon will reach a tipping point where it is no longer, you said, able to regenerate its own rainfall and therefore sustain itself. So when is that tipping point?
It's really important to note that the final declaration cites the tipping point, the point of no return, several times. And this is a first, and this is actually something that we should be pleased about, that the states are recognizing this existential threat, not just to the forest, but to us all, because the Amazon is a keystone climate stabilization region. If we lose the Amazon, there's no way we can hold off the worst impacts of climate change globally. When this happens is really unclear. What we've seen a lot with climate scientists is they make predictions, and often the predictions are quite conservative, because what we see is climate change is speeding up at a rate that we have not been able to anticipate. If the Amazon becomes a degraded savanna, we will also fall with it.
Right. Okay, Christian, that will have to be the final word. Unfortunately, we're out of time for this edition of the Newsmakers. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists so much for being with us, and our viewers, of course, for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter. Do be sure to and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.